It was a very hot day. I was experiencing one of those rare moments of being alone at home. I had taken care of my chores early in the morning so I could have some time for myself, but life doesn't always go as planned. I could never have predicted what was about to happen. As I was trying to relax in the silence, I suddenly noticed the door slightly open. My heart started racing. Being lost in my thoughts and realizing a pair of eyes were watching me was beyond anything I had ever felt. When I saw who was standing behind the door, I didn't know what to do. This was the beginning of an unexpected encounter. For a brief moment, our eyes met. It was my nephew Ethan standing at the door. I couldn't remember ever being this embarrassed. There was a look of surprise in his eyes, but he also seemed like he wanted to say something. I was frozen in place, unable to speak or move. He quickly apologized and closed the door, but the damage was done. It's impossible to describe the embarrassment I felt at that moment. Thousands of thoughts were running through my head. How could I have forgotten to lock the door? Why had I been so careless? As I tried to find answers to these questions, I took a deep breath and attempted to compose myself. Ethan was usually calm and understanding, but would he be able to put this incident out of his mind? As the minutes passed, my embarrassment slowly turned into curiosity. I needed to know what Ethan thought about the situation. I had no idea how to approach him, but I didn't want to leave this unresolved. I decided to talk to him in the afternoon. He was in the living room playing on his phone. Taking a deep breath, I sat next to him. "Ethan, I'm really sorry about what happened this morning," I said, my words catching in my throat. "For forgetting to lock the door. For disturbing you." Ethan looked up with a slight smile on his face. "It's okay, really. I was just a little surprised," he said. His tone was reassuring, but I was still tense. At that moment, I realized the situation wasn't as bad as I had imagined. Ethan had handled it quite maturely, but I didn't know how this incident would affect the dynamic between us. A silence settled between us. Just as I was about to get up, Ethan avoided my gaze as if he had something to say. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked. Ethan nodded slightly. There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about. Something I've been holding inside for a long time." Those words sparked a new sense of curiosity in me. What could Ethan want to tell me? Was it something that would complicate things even more, or just a casual conversation? My heart started racing again. Ethan took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly in his seat. From his expression, I could tell that what he wanted to say wasn't easy. My curiosity and a bit of unease grew stronger. "I know this is a strange situation," he began, "but I feel like I need to talk about this." As his words echoed in my mind, I tried to guess what he was about to say. Ethan had always been a mature kid, but this moment felt like it carried much more weight than an ordinary conversation. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," I said. My voice was calm, but the tension inside me was evident. "I've been wanting to talk to you for a few weeks," he said, "but I could never find the right moment. What happened this morning? Maybe it gave me the chance to finally say something." He was trying to piece his words together, but I still couldn't figure out what he was getting at. "Ethan, just tell me what you mean," I said, keeping my tone gentle, though the unease within me grew stronger. "This is hard to say," he admitted, lowering his gaze and taking another deep breath. "But I think I admire you a bit too much. It's not easy for me to explain these feelings." In that moment, I was utterly shocked. I didn't know what to say or how to react. It felt like the world had paused for a brief second. I replayed his words in my mind over and over, but they all blurred together. "Ethan, what you're saying, it's complicated," I said, my voice trembling as I tried to remain composed. "I think I understand how you feel, but this is a very delicate situation. We might need some time to think before we talk more about this." Ethan nodded. "You're right," he said, "but I didn't want to keep hiding my feelings. After what happened this morning, I felt like I needed to tell you what I've been thinking. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. The silence between us was almost tangible. I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. I didn't want to hurt Ethan's feelings, but I also felt the need to set clear boundaries. Maybe it's best if we forget what happened and end this conversation here, I said. But Ethan, I won't let this change the bond we share. You'll always be family to me. Ethan gave a faint smile and nodded. Thank you. I guess just sharing this with you made me feel a bit better, he said. After his confession, I was left with a whirlwind of emotions. While trying to understand his feelings, I also struggled with figuring out how to respond. Quietly, I returned to my room and began to reflect on everything that had happened. I wanted some time alone to think. I wasn't sure how to navigate a situation like this. Ethan was mature and understanding, but I didn't know how deep his feelings ran or how long he had been feeling this way. I didn't want to hurt him or damage our bond, but I knew I needed to set clear boundaries. The next day, I decided to talk to Ethan again. While we were at the breakfast table, I turned to him calmly and said, Ethan, I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday. Ethan took a sip of his coffee and looked at me. If you think we shouldn't talk about it again, I understand, he said. His voice was calm, but I could see the tension in his eyes. No, we need to talk about this, I said. But we have to set clear boundaries. I respect your feelings and I understand how hard this must be for you. But I'm your aunt, and I don't want the bond between us to change. I see you as family and that will never change. Ethan paused for a moment, then took a deep breath and nodded. You're right, he said. I need to learn to control these feelings. It's just that everything feels so confusing in my head. Trying to smile, I said, feelings like this can be misleading, Ethan, but I'm sure everything will fall into place with time. Talking openly about this is important to guide these emotions in the right direction. After that conversation, the tension between us started to ease. Ethan spent more time trying to collect himself, and I was determined to ensure this situation wouldn't harm our family relationships. After a while, I noticed Ethan beginning to move past these feelings. He started spending more time with his friends and focusing on different activities. The impact of what happened gradually diminished, but it reminded me once again of the importance of boundaries and open communication. That afternoon, I gathered the courage to talk to Ethan again. I couldn't feel at ease until this matter was fully resolved. I thought it was important to address these feelings openly and clearly so they wouldn't lead to misunderstandings. Ethan seemed busy with something in his room. I gently knocked on the door. Can I come in? I asked. He looked up and smiled faintly. Sure, come in, he said. I entered and sat at the edge of his bed. Ethan, I want to continue being open with you, I said. What you said yesterday really confused me, but I believe we can work through this together. Ethan was silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. I know what I said upset you, he said, but keeping it inside makes me feel worse. Looking at him carefully, I said, Ethan, if there's something bothering you, I'll try to understand. But when we talk about your feelings, it has to be with an understanding of our boundaries. Ethan looked directly at me, his eyes unwavering. I just want to make you happy, he said. His words both surprised me and stirred an uneasiness in my heart. I'm not sure what you mean by that, I said. My voice was trembling, but I tried to stay calm. I feel like you're lonely, Ethan said. I feel like you're not happy. And sometimes, I wonder if someone else, if I could give you that happiness. At that moment, my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I understood what Ethan was implying, but I knew I had to address this immediately and firmly. I was determined to set clear boundaries without hurting him. Ethan, I said, these are complicated emotions, but we need to interpret these feelings differently. I'm your aunt, and the bond between us must always stay that way. Ethan lowered his gaze and said, You're right. But letting go of these feelings won't be easy for me. Still, I never want to hurt you. You'll always be special to me. I gave him a warm smile and said, I believe you'll find a way to manage these feelings, but maintaining this boundary is the best thing for both of us. After that conversation, I noticed Ethan's behavior toward me gradually changing. I could see he was trying to move past his feelings. Over time, the bond between us started to return to what it had been before. I hoped everything would settle after my talk with Ethan. However, I could still sense a difference in the way he looked at me. It saddened me and left me uncertain about how to move forward. One evening during dinner, I noticed Ethan was quieter than usual. He was typically talkative and cheerful, but that day his face had a thoughtful expression. After dinner, while I was tidying up the kitchen, he appeared beside me. Let me help, he said. Thank you, but it's not necessary, I replied. Still, he insisted and started washing a few dishes. We worked in silence for a while, but the uneasiness inside me kept growing. You seem deep in thought, I said. Is everything okay? Ethan stopped and turned to me while drying his hands. I was just thinking about you, he said. His words made my heart feel like it had stopped for a moment. What do you mean? I asked. My voice tried to remain calm, but the tension I felt was obvious. Don't get me wrong, Ethan said. I admire you. I know these feelings will fade with time, but I want to see you happy. You deserve that. His words shocked me once again. I realized that Ethan's emotions hadn't fully subsided, and I wasn't sure how to resolve this completely without hurting him. Ethan, I said, thank you for thinking about me. But remember, happiness is something everyone creates for themselves. It's kind of you to care about my happiness, but it's not your responsibility. Ethan gave a faint smile, but the deep, pensive look in his eyes didn't fade. You're right, he said, but it still hurts to feel like you're lonely. After that conversation, Ethan seemed to withdraw a little more. I decided to give him time to collect himself. At the same time, I felt it might be good to put some distance between us, allowing him space to process and redirect his emotions. The distance between us became more noticeable over time. We had always been able to talk openly about everything, but the delicate nature of this situation created more silent moments between us. It hurt me, but it also pushed me to take more responsibility in finding a solution. One evening, the weather was warm, and I decided to sit on the porch with a drink. Ethan joined me a little later. He sat quietly beside me, staring up at the stars. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words heavy between us. Ethan, I finally said, I feel like we're growing apart, and it bothers me. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to look at me. I feel like you haven't forgiven me, he said. Because of how I feel about you? I feel like I've ruined everything. Shaking my head, I replied, No, there's nothing to forgive. But we can't let this situation create a rift between us. Our bond should be much stronger than that. Looking directly into my eyes, Ethan said, I hate myself for being honest with you, but at the same time I couldn't act any other way. Keeping everything inside was eating me alive. I could feel his inner struggle. This young man was trying to deal with emotions he didn't fully understand, and I realized he needed my support, but I also knew how crucial it was for us to maintain clear boundaries. Of course, being honest is important, I said. But understanding your emotions takes time. Be patient with yourself and try to redirect these feelings into something meaningful. Ethan stayed silent for a moment before nodding. You're right, he said, but it's not going to be easy. It's not easy for either of us, I said, but challenges like these are what make us stronger. That night, our conversation seemed to ease some of the tension between us. While Ethan worked on understanding and managing his emotions, I focused on finding ways to offer him both distance and support. Over time, I started to believe we could get through this difficult period together. My conversations with Ethan deepened the emotional connection between us. Although there were still questions and feelings inside us waiting to be resolved, the calmness of the time we spent together was soothing. One evening, we decided to watch a movie in the living room to relax after the fatigue of the day. As the movie went on, the tension between us gradually turned into a sense of ease. I noticed Ethan's silence throughout the movie. While sitting next to me, I occasionally felt his gaze on me, but he avoided making eye contact. This both unsettled me and sparked a curiosity within me. When the movie ended, I stood up and headed toward the kitchen. Ethan followed me immediately. "Would you like something to drink?" I asked. But instead of answering, he approached me and stopped. There was a brief silence. When his eyes met mine, I could read the mixed emotions on his face. "Ethan," I said softly, "is there something you want to say?" He took a deep breath, and the words came carefully from his lips. "I want to make you feel good," he said. His voice was firm but gentle. "It hurts me to see you unhappy." His words both surprised me and left me unsure of what to say. "Ethan," I said with a slight smile, "thank you for thinking about that, but my happiness depends on me, not on others." "I know," he said, "but I still want to be here for you and support you." This conversation once again turned the distance between us into a meaningful closeness. Ethan's sincerity and goodwill added a new layer to the mixed emotions I was feeling. That night, we sat and talked for a long time, trying to understand each other's feelings. The long conversation we had that night clarified things in both of our minds. I didn't want to lose trust in him and wanted to help him channel his feelings for me in a healthier way. However, the complex bond between us constantly pushed me to rethink the boundaries. One morning, while the house was quiet, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. The sunlight was streaming through the window, filling the kitchen with warm light. At that moment, I saw Ethan come out of his room. He had a tired expression on his face, but when he smiled, his fatigue disappeared for a moment. "You're up early," he said. "Yes," I replied. I needed some quiet. We sat in silence for a while. As we sipped our coffee, the silence inside me began to fill with Ethan's presence. His eyes, as usual, were watching me, but this time, there was determination in his gaze. "Sometimes," Ethan said suddenly, "life makes us experience unexpected emotions, but the important thing is what we do with those emotions, right?" "Definitely," I replied. "It happens to all of us. Emotions can control us if we don't guide them." Ethan set his cup down on the table and took a deep breath. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but your presence makes me feel both at peace and confused." His openness was filled with emotional maturity. "Ethan," I said softly, "instead of letting these emotions guide us, we need to strengthen the bond between us, because my relationship with you is very valuable to me." At that moment, Ethan turned his gaze toward me. "Then let's protect this bond," he said. "But for that, we both need to be on the same side." This conversation was the beginning of rebuilding the boundaries between us and grounding our emotional connection on a stronger foundation. The complex bond between Ethan and me had led both of us into deep thoughts. Over time, our conversations became more open and sincere, and the distance between us was replaced by a genuine understanding. But still, the emotional fluctuations brought by this relationship were becoming difficult to control. One evening, the house was quiet. I was reading a book in the living room when Ethan came and sat next to me. Without saying anything, he sat down and started watching me. When I noticed the mixed expression in his eyes, I closed the book and turned to him. "Do you want to say something?" I asked. Ethan took a deep breath and said, "Sometimes it's hard for me to put my feelings into words, but I know it's not right to keep them inside anymore." Nodding, I said, "Being open is always best, but we need to remember our boundaries." Ethan paused for a moment, then continued, The way I feel about you makes me both happy and uneasy. But I don't want to hurt you." Hearing these words, I felt Ethan's inner conflict once again. Leaning toward him, I said, "Ethan, we need to learn together how to handle these feelings, but the most important thing is to go through this process without hurting each other." At that moment, we realized that our bond was strong, but also standing on a fragile balance. While Ethan was trying to understand me, he was facing his own feelings. I, on the other hand, was determined to support him while clearly maintaining our boundaries. That night we sat in silence for a long time. Silence sometimes is a way to express things that words cannot. And in that silence, we had reached an understanding. Ethan and my story was like a journey. Complex, sometimes difficult, but always worth learning from. I didn't know what the future would bring, but what mattered was the present. And in the present, we were both determined to do our best.